Okay, apreciados amigos y amigas, que alegría que estemos todos juntos aquí en la Iglesia de Todos los Santos. Dear friends, what a joy it is that we are all here together at All Saints Church this Sunday morning. Mi nombre es Mike Kinman. My name is Mike Kinman, soy Rector. I am the Rector. Mi pronombre es él. My pronouns are he, him. It is wonderful to have us all together virtually here at All Saints Church. I hope that wherever you are staying safe, you're wearing your mask, and you're loving and caring for those around you, particularly those of us who are most vulnerable. Want to share that at our Sunday food table today, let me get the information from Erica Tamblin. We gave out, where is it? Here she is. We gave out
53.
53, thanks. There we are, Sally. 53 food boxes from Hope Kitchen and 76 masks. So thank you to Erica Tamblin and everyone who is out here doing that. Also a reminder, when the pandemic started, we began to support some of our local organizations with which we have strong ties, and we call them Partners in Love. And we want to ensure that their good work is continuing during these challenging times. And our partner in love this week is the Immigrant Resource Center of San Gabriel Valley. Really an amazing group of folks. They provide quality, low-cost immigration legal services and referral services, helping members of our community navigate immigration law and protect and provide for themselves and their families. And if you're on Facebook or YouTube, you can click on the link that is going into the chat there. It is ircsgv.org, and there's a donate button there. So just go to ircsgv.org, and you'll have a donate button there. And please give, and give generously to support the Immigration Resource Center. We're here this morning on, in some ways, a sad occasion, but also an occasion of celebrating an extraordinary life. A week ago today, Rector Emeritus of All Saints Church, George Regas, passed from this life into the next. It has been a week of remembering, a week of mourning. We especially send our love out to Mary and to all of George's family. And we wanted to spend some time this morning, really just kind of gathering around and hanging out with some of the people who knew George best, and sharing some wonderful stories and kind of letting you all be a part of that. So want to introduce you really briefly to our cast of characters. And we have a whole bunch of folks here this morning. Joining us soon will be Salam Al-Marayati, who's the president of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. We have a familiar face to everyone at All Saints Church, Ed Bacon, who is former rector of All Saints Church and now the interim rector at St. Luke's Atlanta. We have Joan Beerman, who is the wife of the late Rabbi Leonard Beerman and who heads up the Leonard Beerman Foundation. And we have several board members of that foundation on with us this morning. Cathy Clement is a longtime parishioner here at All Saints Church and a career stewardship and development professional. Gary Hall, former clergy at All Saints, dean formerly of Washington National Cathedral and current interim dean of Beloy House. Dr. Eba Hathout is the head of pediatrics and pediatric endocrinology, and she's the daughter of, Hassan Hathout and the niece of Meher Hathout, two of George's closest friends and colleagues. We have Sally Howard, associate rector here at All Saints Church. Susan Russell, who's an assisting priest here, and also canon for engagement across difference for the Diocese of Los Angeles. Jane Olson, another longtime All Saints Church parishioner, former board chair of Human Rights Watch, and a lifelong humanitarian advocate, activist and advocate. Gloria Pitzer, another longtime All Saints parishioner who is a lawyer and aspiring stand-up comic. Bill Rankin, who is a former priest here at All Saints and founder of the Global AIDS Interfaith Alliance. And last but certainly not least, Tim Safford, who is another former priest here at All Saints Church and currently the rector of Christ Church in Philadelphia. Let's pray, and I think we can just pray with those words that George used so often. God dwells in you.
And also in you.
Let us pray. Help us, O God, to be masters of ourselves, that we may become the servants of others. Take our minds and think through them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hearts and set them on fire for Christ's sake. Amen.
Amen.
I want to start with a brief video. Eba Hathout was kind enough to send a video that we believe comes from the early 1990s, when four amazing people, George Regas, I believe that's, did we say that was Hassan Hathout?
Yes.
Yes, Hassan, Leonard Beerman, and Jim Lawson were standing up at the beginning of the Gulf War, and speaking of the need for religious leaders to stand up for peace. So I want to start with just the beginning of that, and we hear George. So Stu, can you get that up? Thanks.
Many religious leaders are saying that this war is on God's side. We tonight, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, say that in the modern era, war is immoral. And that we come tonight, as Dr. Hathout said, to support the troops. Lovingly, prayerfully, we support those troops. We also support that human family broken in the Gulf by this war. We commit ourselves in every way to be supportive of the families who have children in the Gulf. And we commit ourselves to collecting and transporting those necessities of life needed by the innocent people so brutalized by that war. So tonight, we want to say we support in love those persons in the Gulf, but we fiercely, fiercely protest the policies that have sent them into that slaughter, and we call for its end.
Thank you for that. And Eba, I want to start with you. You have so many memories of George and your father and your uncle. We saw those four folks standing up there, and that's such a powerful group. Can you, want to actually invite each of you in turn to share some memories, but Eba, love to hear sort of your thoughts of George Regas in relationship to your family and the work that they all did together.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Eba Hathout. I'm a Muslim physician and the founding president of the Salam Al-Marayati nonprofit foundation, named after my father, with a mission to spread the message of love in God. My father was introduced to Reverend George Regas and Rabbi Leonard Beerman in the 1980s. Their friendship was instant. My father often referred to it as the active trinity. As professor of obstetrics and gynecology, my father was also a strong believer in the sanctity of human life. Following the Quranic guidance, whoever saves one life, it is as though he saved all humankind. So it was hardly a surprise for him to be a vocal supporter of Regas and the Center to Reverse the Arms Race, out of which an undying friendship with Regas and Beerman was born, which was also to include my uncle, Maher Hathout, and our dear Reverend Ed Bacon. In the years to follow, before and after my father's death, I truly came to know the essence of George Regas and appreciate the blessing of having witnessed him. In the annals of interfaith movements, George Regas shall remain a legend. A man whose love of God surpassed boundaries of label and ideology, endowing him to form very special bonds with people of the Abrahamic faiths and others out of pure, unadulterated, divine love. The Regas power did not emanate from support of those who agreed with him, but of many who did not. Salam Hathout, my father, did not agree with George Regas on everything. Regas accepted and respected their differences. He had the ability to focus on what united them as Muslim and Christian, descending from a sacred Abrahamic chain from the one common and loving God. My own introduction to Reverend Regas was in 2001, when he, together with Leonard Beerman and Hassan Hathout, were jointly given the Olive Branch Award by the American Friends Service Committee.
On now. I think she's connecting.
Ever since I met him, I knew I shall never forget George Regas. I was too busy as a young mother and starting physician to attend many other events where they were together against war and for justice. But I watched recordings and came to understand the uniqueness of George Regas as a pioneering symbol of interreligious dialogue. So particularly excited about the vast commonalities between the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Despite the height of his rank and the depth of his knowledge, he was always eager to learn more and was never removed from the new reality of interfaith as the inevitable normal. For those who believe but do not belong, there was always a place in a Regas audience. Of the many memories I have with George Regas, I shall mention only two. After my father passed away, the first 3 days were filled with visitors and phone calls, which tapered down by the end of the week. That's when the wrench of grief was cruel, in the silence and loneliness which I endured as the only daughter. One day, when I was visiting my mother and sitting in silent grief, a single phone ring pushed my hand to pick up the house phone. It was George Regas asking after us. I could read through his words. He simply called to say he was there. Second, at the inauguration of the Hassan Hathout Foundation after my father passed away, George Regas was truly there with us and for us. As many friends from All Saints are aware, the Hassan Hathout Foundation holds a yearly interfaith event titled For the Love of Tomorrow. The first such event was held in 2010. The keynote speakers were Leonard Beerman and George Regas, both of whom were granted lifetime honorary memberships by our foundation. What went on behind the scene before the event was another interesting dialogue. I really had no idea what I was supposed to do. I was a first-time orphan. George Regas worked with me, kindly and gently, helping me with even the most mundane details. For example, I wasn't sure whether people should talk or eat first. And in his usual warmth and bright eyes that lit up any room, he said, "Let's get the food out of the way." This has been our tradition since, and for the 10 years that followed. The Prophet of Islam said, "One cannot thank God without thanking his people." Today I say to George Regas, whose presence is so vibrantly alive this moment, thank you. It is truly a privilege for me to have known you. I know you are now in heaven, so I too shall use your words. Lucky heaven, lucky heaven. My thoughts and prayers are with Mary. I'm grateful for the continued friendship of the successors, Ed Bacon and Mike Kinman, and for my extended family at All Saints, which has since become my second home. Together, we shall honor George Regas by continuing his legacy, maintaining his friendships, and perpetuating his very special kind of love. Thank you.
Thank you, Eba. That was beautiful tribute. Want to go to Joan. Joan Leonard was the other member of that Holy Trinity. What jumps to your mind? Do you have a short story you can tell?
It was the three amigos, I think. Well, I've been thinking a lot about friendship, especially I think this last week when there's been this incredible trauma in the country over division and how divided and how much anger there is between differing people. It made me ask the question, what was it that sustained a 44-year plus friendship like Leonard and George had? And I think that maybe there's lessons in it, maybe not, but I think that there was more to it than their shared values and their shared passion for the less advantaged, their great empathy for the pain of others. I think they became men with each other, men who cared about each other as man to man. They dug deeper beyond their shared values and interests into their humanity, into their commonality of being in a way that I've never witnessed between men before, nor after. I think women do it easier, but these two men did that with each other. They shared their triumphs, they shared their defeats, they shared their fears, their tears, their laughter. There's something in this, I think, that not only expresses who George was and Leonard was, but about how we do this, how we try to breach these divisions. Mary and I were the beneficiaries of this. We got to travel and join them. We had dinners on Ventura Boulevard every month together. And we were not the social secretaries. George and Leonard did it. They made the plans. And we drank a lot, and we ate a lot, and we laughed a lot. And I'm just forever grateful for George the man and who he was in my life. So I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you so much. I want to jump over to Gary Hall, because when we think about sort of longtime friends, you've known George like so much of your life. What stories of George are coming to you right now?
Well, not as much as Tim, but not as long as Tim. But I actually met George my senior year of college, and I worked with George on issues for I met him in 1971 and came to work at All Saints in 1990. So I worked with him on a bunch of issues before that. I have a story about George that I think encapsulates two sides of his personality. George was both a big spokesperson, but also someone who knew people intimately and cared about them intimately. And when I went to work at the Washington Cathedral in 2012, they wanted a dean who would speak to national issues. And I thought, well, the best person to come and preach at my installation would be George Regas, because he really is a model about how to speak to national issues. So George came, and if you've ever worked with George on anything, you know how meticulous he is. So George and Mary came to DC several days early, and George grilled me for days about what he wanted me to say, what I wanted him to say, what my hopes were, what my concerns were, what my dreams were. And I told him a bunch of things. And at the end, he said, "You have any worries?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm a little surprised since I've been here how deeply in the pocket of the military industrial complex this institution is. A lot of our major donors and sponsors were defense contractors. There was a whole military kind of thing there. And I said, I'm a little worried about that." And so George said, "Okay." And then he preached this great sermon, stem winder sermon. And at the end, he says, he says, "I really caution you all to be wary of militarism." And he referred to Dr. King and how Dr. King had, in his last sermon there, had spoken about militarism. And he said, I really call on the dean and this cathedral to reject militarism in all its forms. And about 25 people got up and walked out. And at the end of the service, I said to George, 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 thank you. A couple of dozen people left. And he said, Gary, I did what you asked me to do, And then after that, now that's the part one. The other brief thing is after that, there was this longtime paid soloist, a woman who was extremely jaundiced about Christianity, the church, anything having to do with religion. And she came up to me and she said, and she was crying, and she said, I didn't agree with much of what your friend said. But when he looked me in the eye, I saw there the deepest soul of any human being I have ever seen. And so those are the two sides of George Regas, provocative, contrarian, prophetic on the one hand, but also the deepest soul that any of us ever knew. And so I'm just grateful for all the complex sides of that man and for the many ways in which he blessed my life and all our lives.
Oh, that's wonderful, Gary. Thank you so much. And he said Tim may have known George even longer than you. I want to jump over to Tim Safford. Tim, how long did you know George? And what stories?
I met George in January 1969. My mother used to not tell me about when I had to go to a dentist appointment, and she didn't tell me when I had to go to meet George Regas for my baptismal preparation. And I met in the office there. I was 10, 11 years old. And I can still remember this phrase from his baptismal prep. Tim, being baptized means that you are born into the family of God forever. And then he said, do you want to be born into that family forever? And I said, yes. And that was, that was 1969. And that molded me forever. I was very, very significantly molded by George all of those years, and then honored and to come join that magnificent staff in 1988 and worked with George till 1995. And it was just incredible. I made a list of sort of as a way of trying to make I want to make a point that I haven't seen yet in the obits about what a profound theologian George was and what it developed, and I'm sorry to be a little nerdy here, what a developed Christology he had. So just listen to this list about 1988 through the date May 5th, 1992. These are just a partial list of things that happened. The Church and Temple Housing Corporation came online. AIDS Service Center was beginning to make its presence known powerfully in Pasadena. Union Station was hitting its stride. Gays and Lesbians All Saints became a force and a powerful force, which also led to the sermon God, Sex, and Justice and the transforming ministry of Mark Benson and Phil Straw to George that was so transforming of him. November 1989, extension of the Central American Ministry, the decision to send myself, Susan Buell, to El Salvador to see if we couldn't get into the fight about the death of the Jesuits and their housekeepers and the search for El Correa, the Anglican who was lost at that point. July 1989, declaring All Saints Church a pro-choice church. I mean, whoever thinks you could declare a church as a pro-choice church? That was July 1989 through 1990. The Tutu visit in May of 1990, before the release of Nelson Mandela, was a very significant Southern California event. I better make this a little shorter than I otherwise was going to do, and I'm going to skip over things like the starting of Young and Healthy, founding, I guess I'm not, the founding of Environmental Defense of the Earth Now, and that environmental ministry. And then, of course, I just want to speak to moment of the Rodney King verdict, the first Rodney King verdict, and the ungluing of Los Angeles, and that powerful transformative moment. And I see, you know, a huge step in the development of All Saints towards being much more conscious of its role in trying to understand its own place in racial reconciliation and its own struggle with its own whiteness and so on and so forth. And on that Sunday, May 3rd, you know, Jesse Jackson coming and preaching at Christ Church is a sign of reconciliation. And this, of course, then I think later led on to, you know, the development of Colors, Christians Overcoming Love in a Racist Society, and the emergence of huge important ministries there. And so even though I got about 8 other things on my list here, let me just say, you know, one thing that I profoundly remember is, you know, on Monday, May 4th, the phone rings and George says, "Tim, I haven't been down to Watts in a very long period of time. I really need to get down there. I mean, I've been talking about it. I need to get down there." I said, "Well, George, I'll take you and we'll introduce you to this new man that we just met yesterday, the Reverend Joe Hardwick, Praises of Zion Baptist Church." And this is another one of the alliances, which I notice have not been spoken about so much in the obituaries, the significance of Joe Hardwick in our life in those years. But as we started describing this, and I said, "But George, you know, it's still, I'm not entirely sure it's safe." And George said famously, "Well, maybe we should take your car." But this all leads me to say is that he had a powerful Christology that emphasized reconciliation over atonement.
Mm-hmm.
And I won't unpack that, but the nerds in the room know what I mean by that. And a sacramental theology that was grounded in radical welcome, which thanks to Ed Bacon, I think we moved to understand as radical inclusion. So I'll stop there.
Tim, thank you so much. I want to jump over to Bill Rankin. Bill, you also served on a staff with George, and sort of, I don't know to the degree to which that launched you into doing things like starting Gaia. Can you talk a little about what the effect George had on your life and what stories jump into your mind? So good to see you again, Bill.
Mike, first of all, thank you so much for having me be a part of this. And I'd like to quickly say to Joan Beerman that when I went off after a number of years at All Saints to do a PhD program, I was quite apprehensive and intimidated. And we went back to Durham, North Carolina to do this. And it was when I got there was a letter waiting for me from Leonard. And he said, "I hope that Duke University proves itself worthy of you." And I was so struck by that. And he was a wonderful man, as you very well know. I'd like to say something now about George. I began work at All Saints in October of 1968. On the following March the 13th, 1969, a Thursday, U.S. Army Specialist 4, Jimmy Fullerton, 19 years old, was killed in Kon Tum province in Vietnam's Central Highlands. He had laid down covering fire to protect his friend's retreat from a very dangerous encounter with enemy soldiers. All the Americans escaped. Jimmy Fullerton did not. 3 days later, early on Sunday morning, 2 soldiers in dress uniform appeared at the Fullerton home in Pasadena. Jimmy's mom, Harriet, answered the door. She said, It's about Jimmy. They said, yes. George was called immediately, and he called me, asking me to meet him at the Fullertons, which I did. I witnessed there George's extraordinary and gentle skills as a pastor, doing justice to him and what he said and did in that heartbreaking context is impossible. But I'll never forget what I saw and felt because of him on that day. Just to bring the Fullerton story to a kind of quick conclusion, Jimmy was awarded the Silver Star for valor in combat. His dad, himself a decorated veteran of the World War II Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, helped George with his opposition to the dreadful Vietnam War. Jimmy's mom, Harriet, never fully recovered from her son's death. Sally and I miss George terribly.
Bill, thank you so much for sharing that. That's so powerful. And one of the themes that we've been hearing for quite a while is George as a pastor in just the way that you're talking about. I want to go over to Jane Olson. We have some people who were parishioners of George's, and to talk about how George touched your life. And Jane, what stories are coming to your mind and your heart right now?
Well, I was I've been deeply struck by everything that's been said, and certainly holding back tears, but I was especially grateful that Tim listed the many programs that George launched, programs that were started by All Saints, created by All Saints, really in response to the gospel message, to heal the sick, to house the poor, to act strongly on behalf of peace and justice. His list started in the mid-'80s, but my involvement with one of those programs really began in the late '70s. I was a young housewife with 3 school-aged children when I got a call from George asking him to come up to All Saints and meet with him and our beloved Rabbi Beerman to hear about a conference that they were planning, a conference called, a very bold and courageous conference called Reversing the Arms Race. I listened and in the end agreed to serve as coordinator for that conference. An act that really changed my life. And I wanted to mention that for each of those programs that Tim mentioned and many others, George engaged parishioners to serve as leaders for those bold initiatives. Thereby changing many, many lives and empowering people to call on their inner strength and talents. I think he had a talent for seeing potential in people and for helping people discover their own skills. He certainly did that for me. That conference called Reversing the Arms Race was a 3-day event co-hosted both at All Saints and Leobeck Temple. Thousands of people came. We had a stellar list of speakers that came from every part of society that touched on the arms race, including labor economists, physicists, and certainly leading theologians. At the end of that conference, there was a real demand that we follow up. And so we initiated a new program called the Interfaith Center to Reverse the Arms Race. And I somehow found the confidence to lead that the board of that organization, which, you know, I think for 10 years was one of the leading advocates on behalf of ending the Cold War and ending the arms race. On the board was the former president of Caltech, Murph Goldberger, who had been a physicist, a young physicist in the Manhattan Project. It was really an amazingly strong board. But I think we can take credit for helping to end the Cold War. We certainly changed global history. I was so glad that Ed, at the beginning, you gave George's famous invocation that he used before every sermon he preached at All Saints. That ended with, "Take my heart and set it on fire." George once said to me, I remember, and I still laugh at it, he said to me, "You know, people have come in my office and complained to me about being burned out when I know for a fact they've never once been on fire." But I think all of us on this call, and certainly all those who are tuned in and watch this, have had a fire set in their hearts by George. The fire that he lit in my heart has never gone out, never will. And Ron and I just want to acknowledge the prophetic effect he had on our lives. He married our children, he baptized our grandchildren. He was our North Star for so many years, and certainly his successors have been also. Ed and Mike. All Saints has such a central place in our family, and we really thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of our love and gratitude for George. Thank you very much.
And please don't try to hold back the tears. Tears are holy, tears are healing. So, and tears are incredibly appropriate. I want to jump over to Cathy Clement. Cathy, you've been here a while, and I know George played a large role in your life and presided at your wedding. And just what stories are coming to your mind this week as we remember George? Oop.
You can hear me now?
Yep, can hear you.
Okay, good. Well, I'm probably not the only one who can say that George was there on both the best and the worst days of my life. For me, they were, as you mentioned, my wedding to Paul and Paul's funeral.
Yeah.
George always showed up. God bless him. As he said, we've been together in the most glorious of times and the bleakest of moments. George was the consummate pastor, as has been mentioned. I experienced the wherever you are welcome invitation. My son's father came from a baptism by immersion tradition. So when it came time for Patrick to be baptized, he wanted to honor his grandparents. I got a children's wading pool, lined it with plastic sheeting to cover up the duckies, and put potted plants around the perimeter in the All Saints Baptistry. George officiated while Patrick's father dunked him. And afterwards, I received a handwritten note from George thanking me for what he termed our baptism. I think I know we will all miss this most passionate, compassionate man of God. As he often said after funerals, lucky heaven, lucky heaven.
Cathy, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Ed Bacon, I want to jump over to you. And you knew George as someone who had to sort of walk and sit in his office when he was done sitting here at All Saints, and would love to know sort of what's on your heart and what's on your mind right now.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to everybody. It's been so very moving. George's last day as rector, was April 30, 1995. 3,000 people celebrated him and the Eucharist on Euclid Avenue, and I walked into the office on May 1 as the only person crazy enough in the Episcopal Church to follow George. In fact, Bill Rankin was said to have said, and when George resigned, who will be the new rector? And Bill Rankin said, now we're about to find out who the craziest priest is in the church. George insisted on what he and John A.T. Robinson, his kind of chief mentor, called secular theology. The way George put it is, you can be so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good. He thought that religion had to be in the streets, and it had to be about changing the actual world, not just a pious saccharine experience. And so right after 9/11, we founded the Interfaith Communities United for Justice and Peace in the seminar room, in the Orange Seminar Room at All Saints, and met every Friday, and it's still meeting every Friday. And after the second Gulf War intention, George called me and he said, "Ed, we've got to do something about it. We've got to get in the streets. We've got to get arrested." And I said, "Of course, let's do it." So on Ash Wednesday of 2003, he and I and 9 other people from the ICUJP went down in front of the federal building to be arrested, to protest the second Gulf War. And we got out there and we were protesting, and we thought we were doing something that was arrestable, and the police didn't come for us. And George said, "Ed, what are we going to do?" And I said, "Well, we have to block traffic." So our line of people, of 11 of us, went diagonally across that street, and we blocked traffic. And we saw the police huddle and decide that they were going to arrest us. So they came to us and came up to each one of us and read us the law that we were breaking, asked us, were we cognizant of that? And did we know that if we didn't move that we could be arrested? And we said, "Yeah, of course." So they went back and huddled again. And then they came toward us with the cufflinks, which were those straps, those plastic, straps. And so they said that again. And we said, yes. And so they arrested each one of us and cuffed us. And then they said, then they went back and had another huddle. And then they came back and said, "We're sorry, we don't have any transport for you to the jail. You're going to have to walk yourself to the jail." So the way it worked is George and I were walking side by side on the way to the jail. And we were in our full regalia, our garments. And I said, "George, we are in a procession, aren't we?" He says, "Ed, we will never be in a more sacred procession as long as we live." And it was that kind of life with George. I could go on and on and on, but there are other people who need to talk. It was a sacred procession with him through mystical liturgies and relevant action in the street.
Wonderful. And what a great image. What a wonderful image. Thank you. I want to go to Salam. Salam, you spent some time in some of those same arenas. Can you talk a little about your relationship with George and what stories come to your mind?
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. And thank you to All Saints. And George really made All Saints a home for all of us as Muslims. All Saints became our sanctuary. It became our safe haven, our safe space. And whenever something would happen, the first thought on our minds was, let's have a meeting at All Saints. And George really taught us the spiritual dimension of peace and justice work. That patriotism, if we define it as love for country, you cannot have love for country without love for God. And that's how that's the lens by which we look at the world and we look at ourselves. And that's what George taught us. And that to hate and act has to be done concomitant with the love for people. So I'm so honored to have known George. And when we think of George and Hassan and Maher and Leonard and Jim Lawson, who's still with us, we look at them the same as we look to all the messengers of God. We make no distinction among them. They were all sent for a purpose. And it was just a matter of chance and circumstance that one was born a Muslim and one was born a Jew and one was born a Christian and so on and so forth. But they all taught us to believe in God and to believe in the human family. But they also taught us, get out there and do the work. And the first time I met George was the first Gulf War in 1991. And that's when I met Tim Safford, when both Tim and I were young and brash. And we worked together with Marty Coleman and Chad Myers and others to do these wonderful interfaith services that became, I believe it was reported on CBS Sunday Morning, that what are these three religious communities doing about the Gulf War and about war in general. And then of course, meeting Ed and Mike after that was more of that love that we found. But George, in his famous sermons, would talk about how an Iraqi life has to be equal to an American life for us to be people of faith. And that all life is sacred because every life has the Spirit of God in it. Whether it's Muslim, Christian, Jew, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist, there is that Spirit of God in every life. And that's how we should look at people. So in celebrating George, we celebrate God and we ask God, God and Dios and Jehovah and Elohim, Yahweh, Allah, whatever we call God, we ask God to bring George closer to the wings of mercy of God and to provide comfort for his family, especially Mary, and to continue to guide us on that path, the path of God that George was instrumental in building for our faith community. So thank you, Mike, for inviting me, and I'm very honored to be among you as brothers and sisters as we continue that path.
Salam, thank you so much. And you say those words from George, and they strike a chord in all of our hearts. And yet I'm reminded, Gary talked about the people who got up and walked out of the church when he preached at National Cathedral against militarism. And Susan, I want to go to Susan Russell. Susan, I heard you tell a story this week about how when you were growing up, George Regas' name was one that was taken in vain around your dinner table.
Right.
And so can you talk a little about your history with George?
Sure. Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to be here. I feel humbled to be among such a great cloud of witnesses. I'm a child of the Diocese of Los Angeles. I was born at Good Samaritan Hospital and raised at the old cathedral, following my Aunt Gretchen around, doing altar guild. And then she was a member of a church called Holy Apostles in Glendale that tried to leave the Episcopal Church over the ordination of women. She died with a Save the 1928 Prayer Book bumper sticker on her car. And Sunday dinners were discussions about what that crazy heretic George Regas was doing over there in Pasadena. I lived in Eagle Rock. So the fact that I got beamed aboard the All Saints mothership at one point is sort of a great karma. My other day job, as Mike mentioned, is Canon for Engagement Across Difference in the Diocese of Los Angeles. And all of the differences we've talked about here just were exemplified in George. The capacity to hold fiercely to his Christianity, to love and follow Jesus and make room for everyone else, and to challenge the institutions that were oppressive around him were legendary. The tiny piece I want to add to the story is also his work for the ordination of women in the Episcopal Church. I don't know that many of you know, but at the time, the parish, All Saints, let him go half-time in order to work for a year with the movement for ordination of women in the Episcopal Church. And he wined and dined rectors and bishops and twisted arms and had conversations and helped move that movement forward. And so I think the Holy Spirit eventually would have gotten there, but I know George helped in making my ordination possible, now almost 25 years a priest. And also my marriage to my wife, Lori, possible through the work he did that moved us toward marriage equality. And finally, a moment I'm thinking about that may make me verklempt, but I remember standing with my brother Salam on the steps at the Islamic Center after the shooting in Orlando. And after decades of working in the trenches across difference, in times when LGBTQ inclusion could not be included auditorily because we couldn't get there yet, to hear Salam on those steps say, And if they come for our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, we at MPAC have your back.
Mm.
That was a moment I never thought we would get to. And so in this moment of crisis and chaos and confusion and division and polarization, if we could hold on to the reality of what we can do when we come together, I think there's nothing we can't accomplish. And that would be the legacy George would leave us. So thank you for giving me the airtime.
Thank you, Susan. Sally, I want to jump over to you because I know the huge role George played in your life and in your call to ministry and vocation. And you were able to spend some time with him in his last days and hours. What's on your heart right now?
Thank you, Mike. You know, you're right. My story with All Saints is I was really on my way out of Christianity and religion, but particularly Christianity, because of the ways that the exclusiveness and the hurtfulness to LGBTQ folks. And one of my professors said, before you throw the baby out with the bath, why don't you try that church across from City Hall? And I came that day. And with George's welcome to the table, which we are, you know, so familiar with, whoever you are and wherever you are on your journey of life and faith, you are welcome. I found my home spiritually. And as you can tell, I never left. That was many, many years ago. And it was George who first suggested to me that God might be calling me to the priesthood. And it reminded me of Jane, of your story about the way that George could see so deeply into, you know, other people. I remember also at the door, him looking at me one Sunday and saying, "How is your soul this day?" So I am, will be eternally grateful for him. And, you know, I wanted to share that, you know, in those last days of George's life, his grip of his hand was still strong. And when I said to him, I come bringing the love of so many people with me, his eyes open wide. And he gave me that same look that he's given to so many of us, of just so present. And so that was a great honor. But I took every one of you with me, and George felt that.
Sally, I know, like, I wish Margaret Siedenquist could be here, and she's recovering because you tell that story so well. Can you tell the story about Margaret and George and about how she, you know, bulldogged him?
Yes. So, you know, the story is that Margaret was, had picked up her daughter from school and was heading home, and her daughter, who had wanted to be a physician, said, "Mom, you know, I decided today that I'm going to be a nurse and not a doctor." And Margaret said, "Why did you decide that?" And she said, "Well, because, you know, I think girls are supposed to be nurses and not doctors." And Margaret said, you know, she was extremely upset and went through her mind very quickly of where did she learn that? I know she didn't learn it from me. I know she didn't learn it from school. I know what she's watching on TV. And she said, the liturgy at church is all male. And so she made an appointment. She talked to George Regas, and he listened and said, "Well, let's talk some more." And so Margaret every Sunday took the liturgy, highlighted in blue and pink, references to women and references to men, and she dropped it off at George's office every Monday morning for him to see. And they met sometime later, I think about a year later, and George said, "Margaret, you're right, and we're going to change it." And so that was the beginning of inclusive language. Yeah, and then they worked together. Yeah,
that's wonderful. There's a video clip that I'm not going to play because we don't have time because I want to get to Gloria. But what it talked about is actually he tells the story of how he we mentioned All Saints declaring itself a pro-choice church. Tim's like, who does that? Well, there's a story behind that, and it starts with George listening to someone and their story, and recognizing that choice is something that women needed to have. And so many of his prophetic stances started with the pastoral connection with an individual and being moved by the image of God on someone and the presence of God in someone. Gloria Pitzer, you've been around All Saints for a couple of years, and you knew George pretty well. I'd just love to hear just your thoughts and your perspective and any stories you want to share about George.
Thanks, Mike. I think a part of you was hoping that we would run out of time so it wouldn't get to me.
No.
I was in middle school when George was called as the rector of All Saints. I'd heard his preaching was pretty good, but truth be told, 22 minutes, which was the average length of his sermons, was just the right amount of time to sneak down the street to Thrifty's for ice cream. Fast forward a few years, Thrifty's had closed, and there was no excuse to sneak out. So I actually started listening to George's sermons. His preaching at all times was inspiring, challenging, and uplifting. The downside was we spent a lot of money replacing worn-out pew cushions because every time George got into the pulpit, people started squirming. I had the privilege of serving 2 terms on the vestry during George's tenure and as junior warden during his final year and Ed Bacon's first year as rector. So I actually have a lot of George stories, but the one I want to tell reflects on his pastoral side. In the early 70s, my Italian grandparents moved to Pasadena from Florida to live with us during their final years. I think it may have been their Mediterranean roots, George from Greece and my grandmother from Italy, but a very close kinship and bond developed between them. My grandmother, Vada, was one of George's greatest supporters. She sat in her self-assigned seat in the 3rd pew on the pulpit side every Sunday. She defended him through thick and thin and sent him constant notes of encouragement. She also had his home phone number memorized. It wasn't until after my grandmother passed away that George told us that she would call him every evening before she went to bed. She would tell him that she had had her glass of wine, that she loved him and appreciated him and was praying for him. For many people, this would probably be the basis for a restraining order. But George put up with it, and I will never forget his patience and kindness towards her. I'm sure she pushed her way to the front of the throngs of people welcoming George into his next heavenly adventure. George's impact on All Saints, the wider church, and me personally has been profound, and I will always treasure our friendship. Well done, good and faithful servant.
Amen. Thank you, Gloria, and just thank you to everyone. We've got a few minutes left. I just see from Keith that we can go about 10 more minutes. Would love it if anyone else wants to jump in right now. Is there a story that someone has told that has got you thinking of someone, or something that you weren't able to say?
Mike, I'd love.
Mike, yeah, Ed, go ahead.
I'd love to tell a story about when Desmond Tutu retired. We were invited to Cape Town for the big festivities. George couldn't go. Tim Safford and Mary Regas and I, and Hope went with me, went down. And the first night we were gathered at the cathedral with the Archbishop. And this has to do with George and stewardship. And so we were walking around the crypt, and there were all these holy bishops of South Africa who were in their sarcophagi. However, is that the right way to pronounce it? Anyway, they were in their sarcophaguses, and they were all piously positioned like this. And I said to Mary, I said, you know, Mary, can you take a photo of that? When George and I die, we would like to be interred at All Saints in just that way. And she said, oh no, Ed. She says, they would never put you and George in a coffin that had your hands in a pious position. They would always have your hands stretched out asking for money in position.
Oh, that's beautiful.
George
That's
loved
great.
to ask people to give money for Jesus.
That's right. Well, that's a good and holy thing to do, believe me. So what else? What other stories are
Well,
out
I
there?
was thinking when Susan was talking, George came to visit EDS when I was a student there, and it was the year that he was about to go and work on the ordination of women as the floor manager at General Convention. And I went to see him in his hotel, and he had a copy of Theodore H. White's The Making of the President, 1960. And he said, Gary, I'm going to use Bobby Kennedy's strategy for nominating his brother Jack as the model for how we're going to get the ordination of women passed. So, again, he really was a thoughtful and highly prepared kind of guy. And he was not romantic about the processes of the church, but he sure learned how to work them.
I want to do,
Joan.
it made me think as you were talking about George's seductiveness and in the, as a preacher. And it was before my time at Leo Beck, but Leonard asked George to preach at Yom Kippur, which you can imagine was for many, many an outrage that a preacher, a Episcopal priest would be coming then. George just seduced the whole audience. They loved him. And he started with, I'm sure you're wondering how a preacher from All Saints Church could be here on your most revered day and be the one who gives the sermon. And he had that ability to bring people around. Those that you might think would never be on his side turned out to be obviously on his side. So
I want to mention also the way George's power at the pulpit, I think, was really just extraordinary. You know, we would, Ron and I both are note takers. We would sit in church and outline his sermons. I mean, he always had 3 points, examples and anecdotes under each, which were always perfect metaphors, perfect examples, and a conclusion. And, you know, it was like a perfect essay almost, but it was a call to arms. It was marching orders. And it was always the gospel related to current events, what was going on in politics. I found myself wondering this morning, what would George be saying about last Wednesday? Mm-hmm. But I want to share something, and I hope our friend Tom Johnson won't be mad at me, but he was publisher of the Los Angeles Times and loved to come to All Saints. She always sat in the same place on the right, as you know, in the middle of the right under the pulpit. And he told us, after George died, he wrote to us and to Ed Bacon, and he said that more than a few times, the George's Sunday message ended up in editorials in the Los Angeles Times, right, Ed?
That's right. That's exactly what he wrote. Tom Johnson said that no other thinker influenced him more than George Regas and his preaching.
Wow. I've got maybe one quick thing to add, Mike, if that's all right.
No, please.
I thought about this when Salam said back in those days we were young and brash. And Salam, you know the full story about what it took to get to that clip that was shown at the beginning, which was no small item. But one thing that I will say, because there's so many staff people here, is that George always had your back, like no one I have ever worked with, really. And famously, when he was on sabbatical, I preached a sermon, the resurrection as metaphor, which sort of let the cat out among the pigeons. And he wrote in from England saying, well, Tim Safford just said anything I would have said, what's the big deal? Mm. And then you may remember, some of you, that, and I know Jane will remember this, that when on the same sabbatical, Jesse Jackson Jr., the Reverend Jesse Jackson, was looking for a place to launch a campaign against the Tournament of Roses and to boycott the Tournament of Roses. And I was the officer of the day, and I said, well, I think George would do that, sure. And that was a costly event in my life. And George from England, and once he got back, just put an end to the conversation. It was absolutely right. Now, I don't know if George thought that, but that's what George always did.
Tim, thank you so much. What else? Who's got something?
Well, I'll say one more thing very quickly. That is, and this is what Tim was saying earlier about George being a theologian. When George would take positions on issues, there were certain people in the Episcopal Church who basically made their living by contradicting everything George said or going against it. I'm thinking of Jim Stanton, who became the Bishop of Dallas, who was the rector of St. Mark's, Glendale. I mean, he owes his career to denouncing George. And but what they would often say was that George was just a knee-jerk culture, person following the culture. And the thing that if you really worked with George is that he really read and thought deeply about every single issue. I mean, somebody once challenged him about same-sex weddings and the New Testament, and he got up and gave a 30-minute brilliant explication and exegesis of Paul, of Jesus, of the Hebrew scriptures, to show that he'd really clearly thought a lot about it before he did. So Tim is exactly right. He was an extremely thoughtful and reflective person. And that's why I think that's what made his social witness so powerful, was that it came out of that great, deep scholarship.
Yeah.
Well, as you remember, he would be in his office every Thursday all day long, and nobody could interrupt him. That was one of 2 full days that he would spend. He never went out on Saturday nights. He spent hours and hours and hours on his sermons, and he had file drawers full of clippings and anecdotes and stories on every kind of issue. And I think when that building burned down, it really took George's library. It absolutely broke his heart, because he had for years, saved all those treasures of wisdom, sermons he planned to preach. That was very, very tough loss for him.
Well, and one of the things that's wonderful is we do have so many of George's sermons on tape. We're in the process of digitizing those. Actually, if you go to our website right now, and if you go to iTunes and follow All Saints, subscribe to All Saints on iTunes, I think we have 10 of those sermons that are now on audio podcasts, and sort of a top 10 of George's sermons. And I'm sure there could be great argument over which would make the top 10 list, because there's so many to choose from. But please go check those out. We could keep going on and on and on. And I know that a day does not go by when I am deeply grateful for George, and recognizing that sitting in this office, this is a place made sacred by the work that he did here, the work Ed did here, and just so deeply grateful for his witness, and knowing that you all are a part of that and remain a part of that in the world. So Salam, Ed, Joan, Cathy, Gary, Eba, Sally, Jane, Gloria, Bill, Susan, and Tim, thank you so much. There is going to be many more opportunities to do this. It will not surprise anyone that George planned out his memorial in great detail. We will be following those wishes to the letter, and that means we're going to do something when we can all be back together in All Saints Church. We're going to raise the roof of the place. And in the meantime, we do, Mary, I hope you're watching. We love you. We love the whole family. Want to close with some words from his dear friend, Rabbi Leonard Beerman. Leonard said, "There are those who rise even higher, uniting themselves with the whole of existence, with all creatures, all worlds. It is of such that the tradition has said that whosoever sings a portion of this universal song each day is assured a life in the world to come." What we've heard over the last hour is echoes of that chorus that I'm sure George is singing still. and that through the grace of God resonates through us. Thank you all so much. To be continued. Love you all. Everyone else, stay tuned. We've got Children's Chapel with Kelly Aaron O'Phelan, Meditative Chapel, and then our 11:15 service. God love you all. Bye.
Love you all.
Bye.
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 Love to everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.